Welcome to the Interlocutor Podcast. I'm Tyrel Cameron Eskelson. My guest today is Peter Hessler. Peter is an American writer of narrative nonfiction and has published several books about China. He joins me today to talk about his most recently published book called Other Rivers, a book about a return journey to a region where he lived and worked in the 1990s. Peter, thanks very much for joining me today.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
I'd like to start with the early 1990s. You were doing some type of long-form travel at that time in your life, and that was what brought you to Beijing in 1994. Have I got that right?
Yeah, that's true. That was the first time I went to Beijing, first time I went to Asia. I mean, I didn't grow up thinking about China really at all. And it wasn't something that I had planned. And, for my generation, it wasn't very common to study Chinese. It was more common to study Japanese, but even Japanese was pretty exotic and seen as a very unusual thing. And I wasn't that adventurous in college. So didn't have that interest, but I went to graduate school in England at Oxford. And then when I finished in 1994, I decided that instead of flying home to the US, I would travel around the world, go to the East. I wanted this, I had a couple of reasons. One was just to travel. I was 25 years old and I figured I might not have that many other chances to travel like that. But I also was planning to apply to the Peace Corps and hoping to live in some interesting part of the world. And so I wanted to think a little more about where I might want to go. Those are some of the things, and I wanted to write. So I was planning to find articles. I had already done a little bit of freelance writing at that point, and I wanted to find articles and things to write about and try to sell them to newspapers and magazines. So I traveled with a friend from Oxford. I guess we took a plane to Prague, to the Czech Republic, and then from there we just went by land, so we would buy a bus ticket or train ticket, and we made our way to Russia, and then from Moscow we bought a train ticket to Asia, which of course puts you in Beijing. And really the only reason I went to China was because that was how you could get there by land, from Russia. I wasn't interested very much in China, and people had told me that it was kind of a hard place to travel. It didn't sound like a lot of fun. So actually my plan was not to spend much time there and maybe to go on to Southeast Asia or something like that. And anyway, but we showed up in Beijing in 1994 and I just really liked it. I mean, something about it grabbed me. I think it was mostly just that there was this real energy to it. You could tell that people were motivated. You just had this feeling that something's going on. And I found it fascinating. And, it also, of course, was so different from anything I had seen before that also grabbed me. So I ended up staying there for, a longer trip than expected. I think my friend and I spent something like 6 weeks or even more in China. I just didn't speak any Chinese and really had no idea what I was doing. But we got around the country pretty well and saw some things. And by the end of that trip, I continued, and that whole trip was 6 months long. So it was a very long trip. But by the end, China was the place that interested me the most. And so when I applied to the Peace Corps after that trip, I asked to be sent to China.
And the Peace Corps, could you situate that project within the Cold War and what its purpose was and where you ended up going as a result of joining the Peace Corps?
Yeah, no, there was a book that came out in America. I think it was actually fiction, but it was sort of a polemical book that came out in the 1960s called The Ugly American. Many people have heard that phrase. I guess it actually came out in 1958. A guy named Eugene Burdick was the writer. And it's actually The Ugly American in the book is not what we think of as the ugly American, the person who behaves badly. The Ugly American is actually somebody who's doing a good job in the novel. But the meaning of that book was that basically Americans go to places in the developing world, they stay in the consulate or the embassy or doing high-level business. There's no contact at the grassroots. And meanwhile, the Soviets are winning that. The Soviets are putting people on the ground in Africa and in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam and other places, and they're kind of building better connections, and the Americans don't know how to do that. The Ugly American was it was a character in the book who was doing grassroots work, but that was the goal of that. And so that book was very influential at the time. and a lot of people were moved by it and inspired by it, including a lot of people who worked for Kennedy. And Kennedy, had this idea that we could start something called the Peace Corps and send young people to the developing world and kind of do a better job of outreach and also getting to know these places. But it was a very political project from the beginning there. It definitely was part of this moment when the U.S. was afraid that they were losing to the Soviet Union. It's interesting to look back on that because by the time I joined the Peace Corps in 1996. I think actually very, very few of the volunteers were even aware of that history. It wasn't, the Cold War was done as far as we were concerned, right? I mean, this was, they'd had the end of history, the Francis Fukuyama book, and the U.S. had beaten the Soviet Union and everything was going toward democracy. That's what everybody believed. And so I knew almost no Peace Corps volunteers who thought about that history. But the Chinese were very aware of it, because they remembered that, of course, it was a Cold War project and that it's a type of propaganda, I guess, or certainly a type of outreach, right? And so they were very wary of the Peace Corps, and it was very hard for the Peace Corps to get into China for that reason. But in retrospect, I'm kind of struck by how little we didn't really think about that history very much. We were kind of a little bit outside of time, actually, in the late 1990s, yeah, late 1990s.
So that you went with the Peace Corps to a place called Fuling. Did you have a hand in choosing that specific district or region, or did you just say, I want to be somewhere a little more remote, and that was chosen for you?
I mean, it's funny because one of the things about the Peace Corps, it's not a missionary organization, and it's really not it's supposed to be a developmental organization even. Like your goal, it's not involved in poverty alleviation. There's always all of this misconception about the Peace Corps. A lot of what it's supposed to be doing is cultural exchange. You have Americans go to these communities, maybe they serve as teachers like I did, and they're teaching something about language or something about culture, and they're also learning. They're learning the local language, learning. So that's really much more what the Peace Corps was about. But it does have these because of its founding, I think there is a little bit of a missionary component to it. It's in the culture to some degree. And one thing that was true about that was that you were not supposed to tell them where you wanted to go. You weren't supposed to apply and say, I want to go to Africa, or they said, they really didn't like that at that time. They say, no, you go where we want to send you. And so it's a little bit like the Jesuits or something, in that sense. It wasn't, which they've since changed. Like nowadays, when you apply to the Peace Corps, they want your input. I always thought it was a stupid idea, basically, because I'm going to do a better job if I'm going to a place that I'm interested in, right? I mean, I don't want to, I'm not a soldier or somebody like that, right? I mean, I'm an independent person and I need to have some input. So actually, when I applied, I did something which most applicants didn't do, was I pushed them and I said, no, I want to go to China. Like at one point they said, we're going to send you to Central Asia. We're going to send you to Mongolia. And I said, no. I mean, I was very polite, but I said, I am very interested in this place and I think it fits me for a number of reasons and that's where I want to go. And they weren't very happy about that at various moments. And, but I tried to be as diplomatic as possible, but I was firm. And I said, no, I know, and it did make sense because in China, they wanted older volunteers and we were teaching at colleges. So they kind of wanted somebody who had a master's, which I had. I was 27 when I went, so I wasn't straight out of college. I also could tell that China was a big intellectual and cultural challenge. Like a lot of places, like if you go to certain parts of Africa, maybe it's a big physical challenge. Living conditions could be very difficult. But in China, there's a lot of intellectual challenge, right? You got to learn this language, which is incredibly hard. The culture is very complicated. The politics are very complicated. I knew that was a good fit for me. I felt like I had good patience for that. I had a good academic record, and I was eager to try to do what I could do there. So that was how I pushed them to go there. But once you arrived in China, the whole group showed up at the same time, and we went to Chengdu, which is the capital of Sichuan province. That's where the Peace Corps had their China office, and we did training for 2 months. So we started to learn Chinese. We learned about teaching in Chinese classrooms, and we had lessons about Chinese culture. And then maybe after 5 or 6 weeks, then they assigned us to different towns. And so you got a list of the towns that they were working in Sichuan province. Everything was in Sichuan at that time with the Peace Corps. And you learned about the towns, and you put in requests, and Fuling was a new site, so no Peace Corps people had been to Fuling before. That made it very appealing to a lot of us because you're there, sometimes you go to a place and somebody else has been there and maybe they've screwed up, and you've got to deal with some of their messes. It's kind of nice to be in a new site. It's also a big challenge, because you've got to kind of establish the organization there. Fuling was also the most remote. It was the one that was farthest from the Peace Corps office. I liked that as well. I felt like we would be left alone and have to figure it out on our own. But I mostly really liked the geography of it. I had never been there, but we knew that it was on the Yangtze River and the Wu River, this very dramatic, river landscape with a lot of history to it. It was remote. There wasn't a highway there. There wasn't a railroad, so we knew that that would be pretty interesting. And it's in the Three Gorges region, and that was where they were building the biggest dam in history. And we knew that this area was going to be flooded. So I just thought it sounded fascinating. So I made a big push, that's where I want to go. And I think the Peace Corps also I think the fact that I was older also encouraged them to send me there because they knew that once we were in Fuling, it was going to be hard for them to keep track of us, because we were far away. In those days, it's hard to remember, but it was hard to get around in China. It was the transport was very bad. I mean, from Fuling, if we went to Chongqing, which was the nearest city, it took usually you take the slow boat, which is 8 hours, going upstream. You could take these old Soviet hydrofoils that were kind of scary as hell because they crashed a lot, and there were accidents on the river all the time. But yeah, it was a very different landscape and a very different challenge. But I was definitely interested in Fuling, wanted to go there, and I was very happy when I arrived there in 1996.
When you were living in Fuling, you mentioned earlier that your travels a couple of years previous to that, you were interested in writing. When you were in Fuling, were you keeping a diary or a journal or recording observations in some way?
Yeah, so I had started actually I started freelancing as an undergraduate in college, or even when I was, I guess, after my junior year in college, I took a nonfiction writing class with John McPhee, who's a great
Oh,
writer
yeah.
with the New Yorker magazine. And after taking that class, I started to write occasional articles for magazines and newspapers. And when I traveled around the world, I wrote a number of articles, including for the New York Times. The New York Times used to run these very nice essays in their travel section. I did a number of those where I wrote an essay about taking the Trans-Siberian train, for example. So yeah, I was very much conscious of being a writer. I didn't know yet what kind of writer I wanted to be, and actually, I still thought that maybe I was going to write novels and write fiction. And when I arrived in Fuling, actually, I think the first semester I was still writing short stories, like trying to write fiction. But at the same time, I was taking notes about everything, and I had started that when I was in graduate school at Oxford. I had started taking notes about just daily things. And in Fuling, I really took careful notes about my teaching and about, anytime I had an interesting exchange with somebody or conversation, I would record that. I was lucky that I'd brought a computer. And so I was able to keep stuff, in good files. I did not plan to write a book, though. I felt like I wasn't that developed as a writer, and I felt like, Fuling, you're in this little place in China. Why would anybody care about this? So that was not really my goal. My goal was just to record it. I always figured, you don't know how you're going to use something or when you're going to use it. But if you don't record it, you're going to forget it. It doesn't stick around. Like, you have to record it. I had already learned that by that point, partly because of my teachers in college, like John McPhee. So I was very fortunate that I did that. And I did things like, if you read Rivertown, my first book, there was a lot of quotes from my students' papers. And those are all direct quotes. I mean, none of that is from memory. I mean, I recorded all of that stuff. I spent a lot of time doing that. And it wasn't because I planned to write a book. It was just, I wanted to have this. I also sort of, once I arrived in Fuling, I could tell that there was something important about the moment. Like, you could kind of tell, the things are really changing here. And especially the people I taught, these young people who had come from farm families, many of them had grown up in poverty. Their parents often couldn't even read or write, but they were becoming college educated, teachers. And I could just tell, like, these people matter, like they're important. We're not as Americans, we're not aware of what's going on here, but this is really important. These are really critical people. This is a critical generation. So that also motivated me. I felt like it was kind of my obligation to try to record what was going on.
Those students you were teaching, they were young adults, and this is the mid 1990s, 96, 97.
Yeah.
So they would have been born right around the late 70s, I guess.
Yeah, more like mid, because the college
Mid
students were
70s?
often a little older in China, yeah, at that time. So
Uh-huh.
they were often born 75, 76. Yeah. So that was around the time that Mao Zedong had died. Mao Zedong died in 1976. Yeah.
Right. And the one-child policy, it came in, was it in 79 when it came in?
Yeah, but it didn't really affect rural regions that much initially. So most of those kids I taught, they were from big families. They were still from big families.
Uh-huh.
I remember my last year I taught in 1998, I did a survey of my freshmen. So these were the first year students, and only one of them was an only child, out of a class. It was like 30 something. So it was still very unusual to have a one child family at that time in the countryside. So they were sort of the last generation. The one child policy ended up affecting them more when they were older because almost none of them had two kids. So they were the
Uh-huh.
generation that once they started families and were married, they could only have one kid. And it was pretty strict for them because most of them were teachers. And if you're teaching, you're in a government, danwei or work unit, you you can't break that policy. You'll have some serious repercussions. So almost all of those kids that I taught became single, parents of single children.
Uh-huh. How long were you in Fuling
Yeah,
teaching there?
so the assignment was for 2 years.
2 years.
So
Uh-huh.
yeah, that's the standard Peace Corps term is for 2 years. Yeah. So in 1996 to 1998.
And one of the things that you enjoyed doing and were interested in doing was having conversations with regular people, going to boats or the shops and talking with people, recording your observations with them. It it was more interesting to you to paint a portrait of what life was like for regular people living there than say analyze the big themes of the country like communism or geopolitical rivals with other countries. What about that interested you? The
Yeah, I mean,
regular
some of it was
people.
what I could access, right? I didn't really have
Uh-huh.
access. Of course, I wasn't in Beijing. I wasn't going to be talking to the political leaders. And in China, you can't really talk to them anyway.
Uh-huh.
So some of it was just what was at hand. It also had to do with the way that I studied Chinese. I mean, initially, we did 2 months of training with the Peace Corps, and then we went to this place. The dialect was a big issue because they have a strong dialect in that part of China, so it was very hard. We studied Mandarin, and it was hard initially you had to adjust to that dialect. It was very hard to learn Chinese there. The other thing that was hard is, there's no foreigners. It was me and another American from the Peace Corps. Adam Meyer was also sent there with me to teach. And everywhere we went, people would gather around and stare at you and talk about you. They were just very curious. They had not seen foreigners basically in this town. There hadn't been any Americans there for at least 50 years who were residents. So that was overwhelming. I also it was annoying because like if I went to say like sometimes I was like, oh, I'll go sit down at I'll go to the park and they have these nice little tea houses and I can study Chinese and I'd go down there and I'd have my book out in front of me and then somebody would come over and they'd pick up the book and start looking at it and they grab this and then they kind of start messing with your hair or something and because there isn't the same sense of personal space, especially at that time in
Uh-huh.
China. And for a while, I just found this incredibly annoying, and it's like, and I didn't go outside that much. I would stay on the campus mostly for the first couple of months. Um, and then I suddenly realized that, if you want to learn Chinese, you're going to have to talk to people. And that's all they wanted to do is talk to me. They're just curious. There's no, there wasn't any ill intent. Um, and so I realized you just have to be open to that. And so then I changed my mindset and I would go to the tea house or the park and I would sit down with my book, but I wouldn't expect to do anything with the book because I know somebody's going to come and start messing with the book and asking me questions, but that's why I'm there is to talk. And so that was really how I started learning Chinese, was just those conversations. And I would just go as long as the conversation could go. And I realized I'm studying. These people are helping me learn Chinese. But it also kind of built a lot of interest in just everyday people in everyday life because that's what we would talk about. And so once my Chinese got better, then I was really interested in like going deeper and learning more about what people thought, what they were doing, what their lives were like. And I guess with about 6 months to go in that 2-year commitment was when we finally got email and I got back in touch with my college teacher and we were having a conversation. I said, after the Peace Corps, I think I'm going to apply for journalism jobs. And he told me that he thought I should try to write a book about the 2 years that I'd spent there.
Hmm.
And that was really the first time that I thought about it. It hadn't crossed my mind. And he wrote me this long letter with a lot of detail. And, you know, it's funny because I just almost immediately realized, well, this makes sense. Even though it wasn't something I had thought about, but I was like, yeah, no, this is an important moment, and I think nobody's heard of Fooling, but I think places like this matter in some way, and these people matter, and I think I can write about it. And so for the last 6 months, then I started to plan my book and started to think more about what I needed to gather, what material I needed to gather to kind of fill out my notes.
And through all those conversations, you were gaining experience in how to elicit information, get people to open up, and that prepared you, I would guess, for the journalism work that you went on to do. And did you live in Beijing for a time after that, doing
Yeah, so I
journalism
so I
work?
was in yeah, I was in Fooling and for those 2 years. And then I went home to my parents' home in Missouri and that's where I wrote the first draft of that book that became Rivertown.
Hmm.
So that was pretty quick. I mean, I wrote that in four months basically. And then after that I was applying to jobs and initially I had this idea that I'll find a job in the US with a newspaper or a magazine and I'll work there for a while and then they'll send me to China to be a correspondent. Because having lived in the Peace Corps, I kind of wanted to have a regular job with a salary. I mean, I made $120 a month in the Peace Corps, so I didn't have any money at all. I was 29 years old, and I still had debt from college and so on. But I couldn't get any of those jobs. I was applying to jobs, and the people were telling me the same thing, which was that you have to go to a small town newspaper in America and start that way. And I realized
Hmm.
that if I did that, you go to a small paper and then you get to a bigger paper and then you get to a city paper that might have a China bureau and then you have to prove yourself and eventually you get sent to China. It was going to probably take 10 years for me to get sent to China as a correspondent. So I realized, you just do this now. Just go on your own. While the language is still fresh and you've got this momentum, just go back to China and figure it out. So I went back as a freelancer. That was basically like only 8 or 9 months after I finished the Peace Corps. So I got a one-way ticket to Beijing and just sort of set up there as, trying to write stories for magazines and newspapers. And, that was 1999. And it turned out that was a good time. People in America were starting to be interested in China. And American newspapers and magazines were still doing pretty well in those days. So they had a lot of interest and they were willing to pay for stories. So pretty much immediately I was able to make a living as a writer there. And then after about a year, or a little more than a year, I started writing for the New Yorker magazine, and that became pretty much my full-time thing.
Hmm.
So I lived in Beijing from 1999 to 2007, so kind of for 8 years. A very, really incredible period with a lot of changes in that city and changes all over China.
Yeah, 2007 was when I first went to Beijing, and I spent close to a year there. That was a really interesting time to be there because they were frantically preparing for the Olympics, and
Yeah.
this city was undergoing lots of changes. The streets were cleaned. When I first arrived, I had had a dinner at this open night food market stalls. It was quite long, lots of people there. And 10 months later, when I left, there was some building standing there.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
whole
yeah.
market had disappeared and something new was built there.
Yeah,
But
it was, yeah.
go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, no, the changes were unbelievable. I mean, because you talk about the Olympics, right? So in 2001 was when the committee, the IOC committee, came to make their last inspection before they decided who was going to host the 2008 Olympics. Beijing was bidding for it, but so were other places. And I accompanied them as they went around Beijing and looking at the places where they planned to have competition venues if they won the games. And they gave all these materials that showed these stadiums and things that they were going to build if they got it. And, a lot of it looked really ambitious, like you're like, really, are you going to do this? Right. This is still, this is a city that had like, two subway lines, right. In a city of
Hmm.
13 million or whatever. And so, so it's interesting. I kept all those materials. And then when I went back to the Olympics in 2008, the thing that was most striking was all of those early plans they exceeded. Like all of those, they built, everybody does the opposite. Everybody bids for an Olympics and then they underperform, right? They don't do all the things they promised. The Chinese did the opposite. They went over the top on everything. So, but that shows how much it changed. Because in 2001, we thought they're not going to be able to do this. And then in 2008, it's like, oh my God, 7 years later. And I think the city had like, I don't know, they built like 8 more subway lines or whatever, like it's just complete change of this city. And you can say, yeah, that's just Beijing, but it wasn't, right? The same thing was true in Fuling. And I mean, when I left, I told you there was no railroad, there was no highway. The trip to Chongqing, was 8 hours. By the time I went back, like in 2003, that trip had gone to 38 minutes on a high-speed train. So you're
Uh,
talking 8 hours to 38 minutes. Imagine what that does to people's, mindset, right? Suddenly you're more accessible. You can get to the city easily. Yeah. So that was happening all over the country. Yeah.
I imagine you value quite a lot the memories you have from the 90s because you saw China at basically its last stage before, as you just described, infrastructure and transportation, all of that completely, the development of it completely changed, moving around the country, even to the point where in 2007, when I was there, I'd go to a station in Beijing and get into a comfortable sleeping car and then wake up the next morning in Shanghai or
Mm.
Xi'an. It was a joy to travel
Mhm.
around on that train, but there's I'm not saying it's in any way better, but it be slightly nostalgic or romantic to think like that 8 hour boat ride, I had to do that and I
Mhm.
have these memories and saw it at that time.
Yeah, I mean, it is funny because, I survey my former students. I stayed in touch with about 100 of the people I taught in the 90s, and I give them surveys every year about things, just different issues. And because we have such a close relationship, I can really trust their responses. But one year I asked them, what do you think is the most important change that you've seen in your lifetimes? And by far the most common response was transportation, the change. And
Mhm.
that's the thing that really they notice. And while there is definitely nostalgia about the old days, I think there's less nostalgia about the old buses and trains and everything, right? And I felt that too, because I mean, I describe in Rivertown in my first book when I traveled during the summer between my 2 years teaching, and I went to Xinjiang, in the far west, and then I took a train back to Chengdu, and so that train was like 55 or 56 hours or something, and we didn't have seats. You stood for like 50 hours on a train. It was, and the people were like people lying in the luggage racks, the people were sitting in the bathrooms. I mean, it's just totally insane. It was like one of the worst experiences of my life, basically. And I didn't travel for the whole next year, basically. I mean, I would travel around my town, but I didn't do any more long trips. I was sort of traumatized. I was like, I'm done with this, And so when, I had the Chinese Lunar New Year holiday the next winter, and I said, I'm just going to stay in town and hang out with my friends because I don't want to get on any more of those trains. So, you can remember it fondly, but it was really often very painful, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'd like to switch now and talk about your most recent book called Other Rivers, a Chinese Education. I get the sense from reading that you maybe always had in the back of your mind that you'd be interested to return to this region and teach again. Am I right about that? Or is it something that came to you later that this would be,
Yeah, no, I mean, once I finished my first book, Rivertown, I was in touch with my students and I realized we had this conversation going. I always thought, yeah, no, this is something I want to build on and I'd like to be able to go back to. And of course, I went back to Fuling a lot when I was living in Beijing. Did a lot of stories in that part of the country because I knew people there and I would revisit my friends there and visit places. And so, yeah, I was always very interested in that part of the country and in sort of recording the changes. Yeah.
and so this time when you were moving back, you brought your family with you, your wife and two elementary age daughters, twin daughters, and the four of you moved to the city of Chengdu, where you got a teaching job at Sichuan University.
Yeah.
So how did that opportunity come to teach there? Did you just make an application, like regular job application?
Yeah, I mean, first I tried to go back to Fuling actually. So I
Uh,
applied to teach in the same college where I had taught before. And the people at the college wanted me to go back, but somebody in the government didn't let them in Chongqing, the Chongqing government. And so, for political reasons, because I was a writer and everything, and stuff was sensitive, and that region had had some political scandals, and I think they just didn't want a foreign writer living there. But Chengdu is in a different province; it's in Sichuan. And so, no, I heard about a program there and applied. And they were looking for English teachers, and so I went to Sichuan University. Yeah, and so it's a much higher level university than Fuling was. But when I taught in Fuling, it was so unusual for anybody to go to China to go to college in China that it was almost elite because in those days only 8%, one out of every 12 Chinese would make it to college, like in 1996, the year that I started teaching. So the students that I taught there, even though the college was sort of low level, they were, among the better students in China. It was so hard to go to college for that generation. By the time I returned in 2019, so 20 years later, um, it was by that point it was like 56% of Chinese. No, let me see what the figure is. It's 51.6% of Chinese would make it into college. So you went from 8% to 51.6% basically in one generation, which is really unprecedented, especially in a big country.
yeah. I was interested to read of the observations you were making, comparing students from Fuling in the late 90s to
Mhm.
your students at Sichuan University in 2019. Their appearance, the clothes they wore, their height difference, these were
Mhm.
fascinating
Yeah,
comparisons.
yeah. Yeah, and that was one of the first things, right? So, and when I taught at Sichuan University, I would show them pictures of me with my students from 20 years earlier. And they would laugh because I was so much taller than these kids, And then I would always show them those pictures, and then I'd have some kid in the class stand up, and I was like, "Why did I get so much shorter?" Because, I'm only like 5'9" basically, but I was way taller than most of the kids I taught in the '90s. But then by the time I came back 20 years later, most of the boys were taller than me, and even some of the girls. I mean, and the Lancet, the medical journal, did a study that was published in 2020 that was where they compared heights from young people from 200 countries since 1985. And out of those 200 countries, China had seen the largest increase in boys' height and the third largest increase in girls' height out of in the entire world. The average Chinese 19-year-old male was more than 3.5 inches taller, but about 9 centimeters taller. A huge difference, right? And you really notice
Yeah.
that. Like, I'd go on the subway, in Fuling, when I'd be on a bus, everybody's head was like here. And then suddenly I'd go in Chengdu, they're like, a lot of them are there. Sometimes there'd be a tall kid, right? And I'm looking at his elbow or something. So, it's because of nutrition, right? Living standards. People became more prosperous. And, so this whole idea of, all of these people in China who escaped poverty, like we kind of hear these statistics. We know the numbers, right? That there's, 300 million people, whatever, that were pulled out of poverty but, it's very abstract, I think, for most of us. You don't really know what that's like until you have these experiences and you can kind of compare what it was like in the past and what it's like now. And you see that's even just a physical, very tangible difference.
And that's one of the great values of doing this return journey that you've done is you can make those comparisons and describe in detail all these different changes
Yeah,
that
yeah.
have occurred.
Yeah. Yeah, because
One of
I guess the figure I gave was wrong. It's not three, it's 800 million, right? So 800 million people, according to the World Bank, escaped poverty
yeah,
during this era, right? Since 1978. And it's just overwhelming to think of that number, but then you see all of these individuals and you realize, yeah, this is happening at scale across this country. Yeah.
hmm One of the things that interested me reading the book was the insights that you got into dating and marriage. And I imagine this was just a consequence of your teaching young adults, and this is one of the things on their mind, one of the things they're trying to sort out. And there are a lot of difficulties in finding a partner and balancing that part of life with the extreme competition of getting a good career, which has some outcome on whether you find a good spouse or not.
Yeah, no, in the 1990s, like we always Adam and I would talk about these students, and they always impressed us as a very young and very naive and not very experienced, especially in terms of dating and things, right? So almost none of them dated, and the college had rules against it. Like you were not allowed to have a boyfriend or a girlfriend. If you were caught like holding hands with somebody on campus, you get fined. There was one I wrote about in my book. There was one student who got pregnant, and it was a huge, had an abortion, which of course should just be a quiet thing that she deals with on her own. But there was this huge scandal, and she was kicked out of the school, and everybody knew about it, and just awful, right? And so there was very little privacy for that group in the 90s, and so it wasn't surprising. Most of them had not dated anybody; they were totally inexperienced. But it was interesting to me because when I went back 20 years later, the colleges don't have those rules anymore. Like they're not telling people not to date, and they had classes about sex and things. And there was a very popular class at Sichuan University where the guy talked very openly about sex. And the students would ask questions, and he talked about homosexuality and all this. So it was very open, a very different. But it was fascinating that in some ways that had not changed. Like the students still didn't date very much. And like that professor, like he did surveys with his students and he told me, yeah, the vast majority of them are virgins. They have no experience dating, and no experience with sex. But the reasons were different, right? It's not because of this political pressure, it's because of the competitive pressures, because they're in these high intensity high schools. They feel like they've got to study every minute. And at a Chinese high school, often if you're dating, the school tells your parents. And it's not because, well, it's because they say it's too competitive. Like he cannot waste time dating. Like he can't be out going, hanging out with this girl. He's got to study every minute. So that's kind of the mentality. But it's sort of tragic in a way because you could see that in some ways there was a little more personal space, but that personal space had just been taken over by the competitive demands of the society.
I loved the insight you made about using that as almost a form of government control, that you put this intense pressure to compete with one another, and that focuses them so solely on advancing through education and trying to get into the best schools possible that they don't think about anything else, as you've already stated.
Yeah, I mean, basically, the conclusion was it's not worth trying to fight this system. There's no,
Yeah.
and again, the pressure is part of it. It's like I've got a lot of things I've got to deal with. I've got this exam and that exam and this competition, and I've got to score this, that. I can't put my energy, I cannot waste energy on some political thing that's probably just going to cause me trouble. You also have to remember that these are all only children. So by the time I returned to China, almost none of my students have siblings. More than 90% of the people I taught were only children. And so they feel this intense pressure. They are the only hope of the family. They have two parents and four grandparents, and everybody, all of those older adults are focused on this kid. And so if they screw up, they feel like they've let everybody down. is very different. I lived in Egypt, for 5 years during the Arab Spring, and you have these large families, and there's not much opportunity in the workforce. The schools are really bad, and so young people are like, this system doesn't work. I'm going to go out and protest, they would go out to Tahrir Square and demonstrate because they felt like there's no way out. Whereas in China, they feel like, no, there is a path, but I've got to be totally focused on this path if I want to succeed, because everybody else is competing too. So that's what I mean when I feel like it is almost a form of control. It's indirect though. It's different than just putting a weight on people. They give them opportunities and they have ways, but it's interesting. China was able to set up this system where the educational system's competitive, the job system is competitive, but people can improve their lives. And so they're motivated, and that also motivates them to think about, look, I'm not going to worry about, Xi Jinping. I'm not going to worry about the Communist Party. I've just got to focus on this exam. I've got to focus on this job application. That's where their energy goes.
I did a brief stint teaching in Vancouver, and there came into contact with lots of Chinese families living in the city just south of Vancouver called Richmond. And I asked a mother once who was from a well-off family from Shanghai. I asked her, Shanghai, from what I've read of global statistics, has some of the best schools in the world in that city. Why go to the trouble of coming to Richmond or Vancouver and putting your child in school here when you have the means and have access to some of the best schools already? And she said, there's so little pressure here in Canada on these kids. And so she went to the trouble to bring him here and put him in school here to take that pressure off of him. And reading your book helped me understand a little more just what kind of pressure these kids are under to perform in school. They're studying. When I went to school in the 90s, I studied I'm not proud of this, but studied so rarely. I played with friends all the time growing up. And I get the sense that
even in high school, I had no homework. I mean, I went to a big public school in Missouri. And, so it's not like a great school or anything, but we had some pretty good teachers and some good students. And, but still, I had no homework. Like, I had a job, I did sports. I mean, all my time went into other stuff. I had a girlfriend in high school. I bought a car, I was making money to pay for my car. That was and I never thought about academics basically. And I got into a really good university, which I was probably lucky, but it was possible to do that. Right. And so I didn't grow up feeling that kind of pressure at all. But no, it's totally different. And it's totally understandable why. So a lot of Chinese who are wealthy, they will, if they can get a foreign passport or get their kid into foreign schools, they will often take that route because they know it's miserable to do the other, to do what they call the Gaokao, the college entrance examination in China. It's so difficult. But at the same, and they also realize the American system is more corruptible. We don't understand that sometimes, and you think, China has huge amounts of corruption, but actually the education, like if you're trying to go to a good university in China, you have to get the Gaokao score. You just, that's what there's not many other avenues for getting in. There's a few other ways to get into a good school, but they're really unusual, and they generally don't have to do with money. You can't really buy your way into Peking University or Tsinghua University, these places. You've got to hit the Gaokao score. And the numbers, that's all it is. There's no teacher's recommendations. There's they don't even look at your grades from high school. It's just that score. Whereas, in the United States, there's a lot of ways to game the system, right? You can, if you're wealthy, you can get your kid in, teach the kid to be a fencer or sailing and go on the Harvard sailing team or be recruited for fencing, or you can find other opportunities that make it look like your kid's special when really you just paid money for some summer internship or something for them to do, right? So it's much easier to do that in America. And the Chinese, of course, have figured this out. So a lot of them come here because they realize it's easier on the kid to do that than it would be to be in China. In China, you just got to hit the number.
Hmm. Yeah, we get lots of Chinese students here in Japan as well. They'll come
Mhm.
for a
Yep.
master's degree, and they come, they're speaking Japanese and writing in
Yep.
Japanese, and
Yep.
they're incredible
Yeah. No, I
students
mean,
over
the
here.
Chinese system teaches you to work. I mean, and while I was
Yeah.
living in Chengdu, my daughters were in the elementary, we sent our daughters to
Hmm.
public school for 2 years. They did third and fourth grade. And you really, as a parent, if you have your kid in that system, you understand even better how demanding it is. So my kids in third grade, when they come to the end of the semester, they have a final exam. And the final exam for math is 100 minutes. The final exam for language for Chinese is 90 minutes. English is 90 minutes. Science is 90 minutes. So these are third graders, kids that are 8 or 9 years old, and they have to focus for an hour and a half on an exam. Like in America, there's no way that a kid that age, I mean, they wouldn't give them a 20-minute exam, you know? And those Chinese kids, they learn to focus. Like it's like they're being. I say in the book, it's like being an endurance athlete, which is really sort of true.
Hmm.
I'm a distance runner, and I've coached distance runners, and that's what they're doing in China. At this early age, those kids learn to focus, and you have to sustain. You have to be able to look at that exam paper for an hour and a half and be productive. And my daughters learn that, and I can still, now they're in high school, and it's they are really good at taking tests because they took those 2 years in China, and pretty much all Chinese students can take tests. Like they are phenomenal test takers because of this training, and it's not a useless skill. Like, sometimes people say, oh, they're just robots or something, but that's not really all it is. Like there is some value to it. It's over the top. I think it's too much, but my wife and I always felt like the ideal education would be somewhere between China and the US. Like they were both too extreme. Like I feel like the US is too anti-intellectual. It's often too easy. It's not demanding enough academically. And the Chinese is too much. And somewhere in the middle, would be the ideal.
I was really impressed with how your daughters adapted to the experimental school. And is it that right? Chengdu Experimental School? Is that what it was called?
Yeah, that's the
Yeah,
that's the name. it's like a
the name of the
laboratory
school.
school. Like
Yeah,
it's like in America, there's a lot of schools that are called laboratories. So this was a movement that started in the early 20th century, and there were some
yeah.
versions of those in China. So when you say experimental, it's not like it's a radically unusual curriculum or anything. It was considered to be probably the best elementary school in Chengdu, and it was not a school that traditionally had foreigners. I mean, they were the only Americans in the school of, I think it was 2,000 kids. There were no other
Hmm.
Americans and nobody else who didn't speak Chinese. When they arrived, they didn't speak Chinese. They had to learn the first semester. Yeah.
And had to study after their rigorous, study at school. They'd come home and study
Yeah.
10 to 20 kanji per day, how to identify them, what they
Yep.
mean, and how to write them.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah. So
that's
it
that's
was it
an
was hugely
incredible
demanding.
workload. Yeah.
Yeah, and my wife did a lot of it. I mean, I did as much as I could, but she did most of it in terms of overseeing this. The teachers were phenomenal. Like they were very welcoming. So they allowed our daughters, for the first year, our daughters really didn't do most of the homework that the other kid, like in science and the other classes, they were just, okay, our priority is for you to learn Chinese. So you focus on the Chinese, you learn the characters, you learn to keep up in our Chinese classes, and then also math. And so for the beginning, that's what we focused on. By the second semester, then they started to be able to do the other homework, and eventually they were totally mainstream. By the second year, they were doing everything the exact same as the Chinese kids.
Yeah, I liked in the book how you often give glances into how the parents are communicating with one another on
Mhm.
uh, WeChat or the
Yeah,
social messaging apps. That
yeah,
was valuable because from the outside I have an idea, just a small idea of maybe some of the pressure and intensity of what these families are going through. But I loved those insights of they're coordinated, they work
yeah,
together, and
yeah.
if
And the
someone's
teacher
having
demands
trouble
them. Yeah,
with
yeah. And the
homework,
teacher tells them to work. Yeah.
yeah.
So they help the teacher out. The teacher says, "You guys organize this, you get that, you gather these fees," and the parents do it. And the other thing that I talk about in the book is they don't criticize the teacher, right?
Hmm.
So Like in America, it's very common to blame the teacher for everything. In China, they don't do that. The teacher is in charge. And you respect the teacher, of course, if you're a student, but if you're a parent as well, you respect the teacher. And you're not telling her what to do. You're not giving her advice. They had all these incredible exchanges all the time that I was seeing on the WeChat channel, but nobody's ever making a suggestion to the teacher and saying, how about we learn this instead? No, she's not going to take that. And we went, they have parent teacher conferences. Of course, in America, you have the parent teacher conference, and it's just you and your wife and the teacher, and they talk about your kid. Sometimes they have the kid there as well, and it's, very positive and gentle and everything. And in China, it's all of the parents at once. So, and you go and you sit in your child's desk. And so because you have two parents and there's only one kid, you have to choose one parent to represent the family, basically. Now we had twins, so both Leslie and I would go to these, but you sit there in the classroom in the desk, and then the teacher, and it's funny because when the parents sit down at the desk, you can kind of see them turning into children. Because all of them were conditioned from their own memories. And so they sit in a very orderly way. They're not fiddling with their phones or messing around because they remember when they were kids. You have to pay attention. It's like you can see they're so conditioned from this system. And then the teacher lectures all the parents, and she tells us what the kids did well, what they did poorly. And there were no questions. Nobody asks a single question, from the parents. It's really amazing, like totally different from anything I'd seen before.
And that conditioning, when your daughters returned back to America and went to public school, whatever school they were at in Colorado, they had to stop themselves from doing some of those things they were conditioned to do, like standing up before speaking.
You have your hands on the desk kind of like this in front of you, and your both feet are always on the floor. You sit straight, and when the teacher calls on you, you stand up before you answer. And my daughter Arrow's like the whole first week she was having to stop herself from doing all of these things. Yeah.
But I'd like to try and, if I can, get at a couple more questions in before we wrap up our conversation. I'm really curious to get your take on what sense you got about your students' opinions on Taiwan and the potential for war, violence in the Taiwan Strait. It's something that I'm really concerned with. I have lots of friends in Taiwan and recently traveled there for a long period of time, and something that I'm trying to learn as much as I can about, because I think it's really important these next few years about maintaining peace there. From the Chinese side of it, do you have any insights into what young people think about this issue?
I mean, the young people care about it in the sense that they've been taught that it matters and they believe it, so it would be very unusual to meet a young person who says that's not really a very important issue for China. And they're very sensitive about it. I mean, I talk in the book one time, my wife, Leslie, she's Chinese American. She also worked in China as a journalist for many, many years. And at one point she came and talked to my students, and she said a phrase in English, which is, she said, China and Taiwan. And it's partly because, like, in Chinese, when you say that, you don't actually say China, you say 大陆, the mainland. You would say Taiwan and the mainland. But in English, you don't really say, it sounds weird to say the mainland and Taiwan. So she just said China and Taiwan. But that's not cool. Like, you can't say that, because even just saying that makes it sound like they're separate. And one of my students who I was close with later told me, yeah, some of the kids were kind of upset and they thought about interrupting her to correct her, and it was like, she wasn't talking about Taiwan. It was like some just off the main topic. Right. But in the end, the kids kind of decided not to say anything, but it was fascinating. That really triggered them. Like, that's how conditioned they are. Like, they've had all these classes, and none of those, maybe a couple of the kids had visited Taiwan as tourists, but most of them had never been there. They don't have any connection to it, whereas Leslie's family actually had fled the communists, and her parents grew up on Taiwan after fleeing the revolution in 1949, and then they went to America as grad students. So if anybody should have been sensitive about it, it's Leslie, right? But because she hadn't been trained, she doesn't care what anybody says about Taiwan. She doesn't care what they say about China. She was trained in an American system that didn't focus on these issues. So she has her own ideas and she's comfortable with them, right? But you could really sense that, yeah, this is something that has been, in this sense, the propaganda has been very effective. Like, there are other a lot of other things that the young Chinese are very cynical about, and they don't believe what the government's saying. But I would say that Taiwan is something that they say, no, that's non-negotiable, and you're a foreigner. I don't really want you talking about that issue. That would be their general response. Like, you have no right to talk about it. You have no right to tell me what you think about Taiwan. You're going to offend me. That's the view. This is my issue. This is ours. It belongs to us. It doesn't belong to Taiwan either. I don't care what they say, That would be the general response, which of course is totally unreasonable, and so you don't end up having many of those conversations because they're not productive. There's lots of other issues in China that I could talk about, but Taiwan was not one of the ones. For certain very enlightened intellectuals, you can have those conversations, but for most people, you can't. Even highly educated people. My view on that, though, while that does, when you see that, it is disturbing, right? I mean, it is something that concerns you. I tend to feel like the security side of that issue has been overblown in the U.S. I just think the U.S. is a very militaristic society, and we tend to view everything through the eyes of military and security. And so when we look at Taiwan, it's an entirely military issue. And when the Chinese talk about this, they use a lot of military language, but in truth, Chinese society is really not that militarized, I mean, you talk to like elite Chinese or Chinese, or like all those people whose students are studying, you can ask them, do you want your kid to go in the army? They'd say, what are you talking about? I don't want my kid to be in the People's Liberation Army. It's crazy. Like it's not an aspirational path. Whereas in the US, it really is, right? I mean, sometimes, you can go to West Point or these service academies, or there's lots of ways that you can use the military to build your career for all different classes in the US. That's not really true in China. In China, if you're an educated person, you don't want your kid in the military. It's not that militarized of a society. And if you just look at their patterns, their solutions over the last 30 years do not tend to be military solutions. They've found economic solutions, they find political solutions. And so I think, and diplomatic, right? And so it doesn't mean that you say, oh no, they're never going to attack Taiwan. Of course, you have to keep that in mind and you have to be prepared. But I think we underinvest in diplomacy. We underinvest in understanding the cultural side of things there. And that's more likely the way that issue is going to be worked out if it's ever worked out.
I hope so.
In my opinion. Yeah.
I think I better get to my last question here. I'd like to ask you about, as a writer, coming up with the title and subtitle of your book. When in the process of writing Other Rivers, A Chinese Education, did you come up with this as a title? And the word education in the subtitle, does that apply not just to the students you were teaching, but also your ever expanding education about China as well?
Yeah, no, I said, my first book was called Rivertown. And I kind of like the idea of having the word river somewhere in the title for this book. And while I was living in Chengdu, I was reading something because I was teaching my students a literature class, and I was reading about John Steinbeck, and I realized that his book East of Eden, which was my favorite John Steinbeck novel, one of the titles that he thought about for that book was Other Rivers. And so I said, oh, that's a nice title. That might work for me. So I took that from John Steinbeck, actually. And then the subtitle of Chinese Education, education runs throughout this book. I was a teacher in China in two different periods, and I'm writing about what it was like to teach there. My daughters were students in a Chinese school. The people that I taught in China became teachers. So education is one of the issues that I'm writing about in depth. And of course, for me, it is also all of my education has been through Chinese education in a way. Like that's how I learned about China, was in China, in Chinese schools, in Chinese educational environments. I did not study China in the United States. I never took a class on it in college. I didn't study Chinese in the U.S. So my own education about China is connected to the Chinese educational system. It's the environment in which I learned, as much as I could learn. So yeah, so that was something I was trying to emphasize with that subtitle.
So I hope the students that you taught at Sichuan University, that you keep in touch with them, and as they raise their children, and those children grow up to be university age in 15 to 20 years from now, you'll go back and do this a third time?
I'd love to. Yeah, no, I hope to.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends on the politics.
Hmm.
It really depends on if people are open to letting me do it. But I'll stay in touch with all of these students. No question. I mean, we're in touch all the time, and I'm writing to them, and I hear from them all the time. So yeah, no, it's been I was very fortunate with both of my teaching experiences, and I have to say that even though these are very different generations and they have very different issues, I felt the same sort of affection for each of them and sympathy. I really found them. I was impressed with both generations. I felt like even though China is more prosperous now, the students are not spoiled. They're not. They haven't been ruined by prosperity. They haven't become lazy. They're incredibly hardworking, incredibly diligent, and I respect that.
Well, I really enjoyed the book and the opportunity to speak with you today. Thanks so much for your time. It was great.
Yeah, no, thank you. No, it's my pleasure to talk with you. Thanks so much.